Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rubio, as I said in my opening statement, I hope that this committee can better collaborate to swiftly confirm career Foreign Service officers. These are patriotic Americans who have served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, and they work to advance U.S. national security interests. Delays in vacant posts hurt America's interest. I know you agree with that because we've had that conversation. But will you commit to working with Chairman Risch and me to prioritize the advancement and confirmation of career State Department officials?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but I would also point to this fact that I think we're going to begin by prioritizing. We're going to look at what are the key issues in the world. There are obviously every post in the world is important or it shouldn't exist. And then the question is, which are the ones we bring to you first? And those are the ones that I think are most critical. So obviously, I think you'll see our nominees for the deputy posts, which are critically important, all the undersecretaries as well. And what I've endeavored to do is we interview and identify people, and I believe I've met with and interviewed most of the candidates for those top posts, is I want to bring you people that are three things. Number one, are aligned to the mission. I think that's critically important, whether they be Foreign Service officers. I'm not talking about political alignment. I'm talking about alignment with the mission that we've outlined for American foreign policy, which is one of the things that I think has hurt the State Department under numerous administrations, is sometimes the mission, or what it is the core mission of the department has not been well defined. That's on us, and it's our obligation to define that. So number one, aligned to the mission. Number two, the capability to do the job. And I can tell you now that in my entire service on this committee, which spans 14 years, we always had fellows from the Department of State, I believe all of whom are still in the service of our country. And I intend, because I know them and I've worked with them, to utilize their skill sets in the department. And in fact, a couple who we hope will be returning home soon from foreign postings to work with us at the State Department closer to my office. But the point is that we want to have people that are highly capable, both those who we bring from what they call political appointees, but also those that are promoted from within the Foreign Service. And then the third are people that we can get through the committee, because time is of the essence. Now, you may not agree with all their views, whether they be Foreign Service officers or whether they be political, but I think it's important and we're not going to exclude someone just because we think that maybe they're going to have a rougher confirmation process than someone else. But I do think it's important that we have people in these positions as quickly as possible, and having served for 14 years on that side of this room, I understand that one of the things we can do to help expedite that is to bring you people that will do a good job, who are qualified for the job or mission aligned, but also that can move through this process quickly enough so that they can be at post and begin to fulfill their duties. If I have to wait a year to get them in place, well, I'm not sure on some of these issues we face today, we have a year to wait.
I certainly agree with that, and I appreciate your focus on mission and qualifications, because I think the committee will be looking closely at that. I want to go now to NATO, because in 2023, Congress overwhelmingly passed the bipartisan Kane-Rubio provision prohibiting any president from withdrawing the United States from NATO without Senate approval or an act of Congress. Will you commit to adhering to Senate approval or an act of Congress as required under that law that you authored if President Trump attempts to withdraw the U.S. from NATO?
Well, first let me say that President Trump has appointed an ambassador nominee for NATO, which clearly indicates his role to engage in that. Second is the law is what it is. Obviously, as you've mentioned, I was a co-sponsor of the law, and so it's tough to say I'm not in support of a law that I hope to pass, and that I think it's an important role for Congress to play, because frankly, it's not just about the withdrawal piece of it, it's the contributions we make towards the power of the purse still resides with the Congress. Now maybe, as if confirmed, moving towards the executive branch, I'll become I'll forget that lesson a little bit. I hope not. But ultimately, I still recognize and understand that the power of the purse is with Congress, and it's an incredibly important power. Let me point on NATO one thing. I think there's a misunderstanding about it. The NATO alliance is a very important alliance. I believe that. I believe alliances can be, and has been very useful. Without the NATO alliance, there is no end to the Cold War. In fact, without the NATO alliance, it's quite possible that much of what today, at the time, today we know as Europe, would have fallen victim to aggression. But what's important for the United States is not just to have defense allies, it's to have capable defense allies, allies who are capable of defending their region. And I think there is a question to be asked. I'm not stating a public policy position, I'm stating a question to be asked, and that is, should the role of the United States in NATO in the 21st century be the primary defense role or as a backstop to aggression? with countries in the region assuming more of that responsibility by contributing more. Now look, in fairness, and I think the further east you move in Europe, the more money you see spent on the military as a percentage of GDP. But I think there's been broad acknowledgement across Europe and across multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that our NATO partners, these are rich, advanced economies, need to contribute more to their own defense and ultimately to the NATO partnership as well. And that's a demand that's been made by multiple presidents across the years. And the fact that that is true has been revealed by what's happened with Ukraine. Look at the ramp up in defense spending and the industrial capacity of multiple countries in Europe as a result of an armed conflict. Imagine if that capacity had been there before, it quite possibly might have had a deterrent effect as well. So I think it's important that we have alliances, but we have to have alliances with strong and capable partners. And not those who sort of have viewed the U.S. and the NATO defense agreement as an excuse to spend less on defense and more on some domestic needs. We have domestic needs too. These advanced, rich countries in Western Europe have enormous safety nets programs that they fund. We have domestic needs as well, but they've been able to divert or grow those programs because they don't have to spend as much on defense as we do as a percentage of our overall economy. And that dynamic needs to change. And I expect that President Trump will continue to forcefully make that point.
And as you know, this committee and the Senate NATO Observer Group, which I co-chair, has made that point repeatedly, and we are now up to 23 of the 32 NATO nations who are meeting their 2% of GDP, and we have a number of them who are going beyond that, and it's appropriate. And I think the sentiment on this committee would be to agree with what you're saying, but to ensure that we continue to have a strong NATO, I think will be important not only to European security, but most important to our own security. I appreciate, we talked about Ukraine. I appreciate your past leadership in supporting Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. More recently, you voted against supplemental funding for Ukraine and against forgiving loans for Ukraine in November, loans that would be critical to Ukraine's economic stability. So can you talk about how your views on Ukraine have developed and where you are now, and what you think is important for us to do in order to ensure that there is the strongest possible negotiating position if Ukraine and Russia do get to the negotiating table?
Sure. First, let me point out, although I'll still speak to my view of the process, that I voted against that bill because I said I would not vote for a bill unless it addressed the crisis at our southern border as part of the overall arrangement. That was not done, and so I voted against it. That said, here's my view of a situation. Once this war became what we now know it is, and that is a war of attrition, a stalemate, a protracted conflict, the dynamic on that situation has changed. It has. And I believe, and I think that this echoes with the president. Let me first echo the president's words and what he said in an interview about a year ago. He was asked about the war in Ukraine. He says, I want the dying to stop. I want people to stop dying. I want the killing to stop. And frankly, I don't know how anyone could say they don't. The destruction that Ukraine is undergoing is extraordinary. It's going to take a generation to rebuild it. Millions of Ukrainians no longer live in Ukraine. And the disruption, that means how many of them are going to come back, and what are they going to come back to? Even as I speak to you now, the Ukrainian infrastructure and their energy infrastructure is being decimated in ways that are going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild over the next decades. So this is an important conflict, and I think it should be the official position of the United States that this war should be brought to an end. And the question becomes, what role can we play? And I think the first is by making that abundantly clear. And my differences with the Biden administration throughout this process is that they never clearly delineated what the end goal of the conflict was. What exactly were we funding? What exactly were we putting money towards? And many occasions it sounded like however much it takes for however long it takes. That is not a realistic or prudent position. The truth of the matter is that in this conflict, there is no way Russia takes all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are too brave and fight too hard, and the country is too big. That's not going to happen. It's also unrealistic to believe that somehow a nation the size of Ukraine, no matter how incompetent and no matter how much damage the Russian Federation has suffered as a result of this invasion, there's no way Ukraine is also going to push these people all the way back to where they were on the eve of the invasion, just given the size dynamic. I saw a quote recently, and I wish I could attribute to who it was, but the quote was, and I think it was very wise, where they said the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it, but this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like is it's going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor, but it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And we're going to have, in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States has lent itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage. Putin's goal now is to have maximum leverage so that he can basically impose neutrality on Ukraine, retrofit, and come back and do this again in 4 or 5 years. And that's not an outcome I think any of us would favor. By the same token, I think it's important that the Ukrainians have leverage, but they also will have to make concessions to reach this agreement. It's going to be very difficult. This will not be easy. Conflicts of this nature that have historical underpinnings to it are going to require a lot of hard diplomacy and tough work, but that's something that needs to happen. This conflict needs to end.
Well, I'm out of time, but I appreciate your last comment about the importance of leverage, and it's important for the United States to do what we can to help provide that leverage to Ukraine so that they can be in the best negotiating position possible with Russia. Thank you very much.